The purpose of the book is actually changed. You say in the epilogue, I think, is where I read this, that you were going to have a book with a somewhat narrower focus. It was going to really look closely, which I think it still does, on one of the characters in it. And your agent said, no, you should work more broadly. You should get into the whole morass, I think, of the death penalty. And so you do. For example, when you're telling your main story about Mr. Elmer, you also bring in other cases that are going through the appeal system all the way up to the Supreme Court, so that when one is through reading the book, it's like having taken a bath in this whole business. Sometimes I want to thank you for that, and sometimes I don't. So why did you decide to go so broad?
Well, interesting way you say it, like taking a bath, and it reminded me, and I think I have it a line in the book, is, and when I was writing it, I used to think I'm writing this part for Hollywood and part for Stanford Law School, which is where I went, because there's a lot of it is about the law, judicial system in America. But then, of course, there's a very compelling case of the defendant, Edward Lee Elmore, and the lawyer, Diana Holt. So it is part Hollywood and part for law school. I went more broadly because I had an extremely good editor, Jonathan Siegel at Knopf, who really pushed me. He said, the story about Diana Holt and Edward Lee Elmore is compelling, but you need to make it broader. And he would write in the margin, Jim, I mean, you've interviewed a lot of authors, so you'll appreciate this. He would write in the margin, what's the role of the defense counsel? What's the role of the prosecutor? And, my first reaction was, everybody knows that, don't they? And then I started looking back and I realized I didn't know it, which meant I was either on the golf course or skiing when I should have been at class at Stanford, or I'd forgotten what I'd been taught. And I went back and I did a lot of reading into those things and was fascinated particularly about the role of the prosecution.
Yeah.
I mean, the prosecution's role, contrary to what most people think, is not to get a conviction. The role of the prosecutor is to do justice.
Which is very, very different.
Yeah, very different. And the obligation of the prosecutor and the obligation of the defense are very, very different. The rules are different. The ABA, American Bar Association standards of ethics are different for each side.
What's the basic essential role then of the defense?
To gain an acquittal for your client. And it is not the role of the defense counsel to ask, is my client guilty or not? Your obligation is to defend him to the best of your ability. And in this case, the defense counsels were lousy, as we know they are in so many of capital cases.
Yes.
We've had sleeping lawyers, we've had drunken lawyers, we have the famous Fifth Circuit opinion saying, well, just because you're entitled to a lawyer doesn't mean you're entitled to an incompetent or an effective lawyer. And in Elmore's case, and that's why I call it an anatomy of injustice, because you had his lawyers. One was called the drunken cowboy, and the other referred to his client as the redheaded. And that was his trial lawyers. On appeal, he had very good lawyers. But then if you look at the other side, the prosecution was equally irresponsible, more so because the prosecution's obligation is to do justice, not necessarily to gain a conviction.